What is up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Border City Kids When Nature Strikes. I'm your host, Brian, and it is great to see you guys tonight. Tonight's live video, we are going to be covering Hurricane Wilma from 2005, and 2005 was a very active hurricane season, so we're just going to wait a minute or so before we get started tonight, but please subscribe if you haven't already. Please like the episode and share the show, of course, to people you know. That would be great. We're just going to hang out for a minute before we get started here tonight, but I welcome you. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and welcome to the Border City Kids Live on a Thursday again. It's good to see you guys. Welcome to the show. I hope everyone has a good weekend coming up where I'm from. I see the weather's about to turn quite big. Our temperatures are about to drop 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit where I'm from, and we're about to see an early fall snowstorm by the looks of it, Sunday into Monday, which could cause some issues with driving around here, because it looks like the rain's going to turn to snow, and then we're going to get some snow on top of the frozen rain. So could cause quite an issue for commuting Monday morning, but we'll see. We'll find out what happens. I think we're a couple days out still, so we'll see what changes in the forecasting and the predictions. So let's get started tonight with the 2005 Hurricane Wilma, which was a Category 5 storm in the Caribbean, and it was a very powerful storm, caused tons and tons of damage. And we'll take a look at tonight the formation, the places impacted, and of course the recovery that was done after the storm passed through. So welcome once again. So let's take a look at Category 5 in 2005, the Category 5 storm Hurricane Wilma. So this is just a track that I've put up here of where the actual storm started, and you can see that this is down near Jamaica. It formed into a tropical depression and then formed into a tropical storm, and then moved its way up through the Yucatán Peninsula, hitting portions of Mexico, and then firing off northeast towards Florida, where it made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane at the time. But you could see that it did become, because of the low wind shear and the warm ocean temperatures, that this became a Category 5 monster. And this was 20 years ago already, which is pretty wild. So have a look here. This just shows the impact points reaching 185 mile per hour winds. And this was an absolute beast when it came to wind speed, and also the barometric pressure at 882 millibars. This reached one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded. And this actually took place after Hurricane Katrina had already fired through New Orleans. So this was actually after the fact, on October 15th to the 25th. I believe Hurricane Katrina was in August, so this was a couple months later, but everyone was on alert in this area after just getting clobbered by Hurricane Katrina off to the west. So let's take a look at how this storm actually formed. So once again, thank you for joining me if you are here on this episode of When Nature Strikes, the live edition on Thursday nights. Let's get into this one. So this storm began quietly and transformed into a Category 5 monster. And it holds the title, like I said, for being one of the strongest hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic, and had a central pressure of 882 millibars. That was lower than Hurricane Katrina or Rita from the same year. So both those were beasts when it came to when that actual year occurred. There were tons and tons of actually named storms, and I believe they actually ran out of the alphabet. Tonight we're going to explore how it formed, intensified, and impacted millions across Mexico, Cuba, and the United States. We'll also compare just briefly to a few other hurricanes that year. To understand Wilma, you have to set the stage. The year was 2005, and this was a record-breaking hurricane season. And it never seemed to come to an end because there were so many storms firing off left, right, and center. It was a pretty wild hurricane season. Meteorologists ran out of regular storm names on the list, and for the first time ever, the National Hurricane Center began using the Greek alphabet. I believe Gamma, Beta, Omega, all these kind of names were thrown into the hurricane name list because they ran out of alphabetical names. So the ocean temperatures across the Atlantic and Caribbean were extremely warm this year, and this obviously creates the perfect conditions for hurricanes to form. Low wind shear meant that these storms could grow. There weren't any crosswinds. There were no low-level winds or upper-level winds. They were just able to freely form based off the warm ocean temperatures themselves. And we know through the past, I don't know how many, we'll say 30, 40 years, that there's a direct connection to the ocean temperatures and the intensification process of these hurricanes. Let's see if I can load up another picture here. When we look at the actual strongest storms in the history of hurricanes, the top hurricane was Allen. I believe that was like 1980, and it recorded winds of 305 kilometers per hour. Wilma was down here 10 kilometers an hour short, and that's directly related to the barometric pressure, which you see is 882 millibars. So this was a very strong, very concentrated storm. I believe it was very symmetrical, had a well-defined eye, so it made its impact for sure. It was a very big storm. When we're talking about hurricanes forming, and I'm just going to relate this pretty much to the 2005 hurricane season, there are two vulnerable areas that are out in the ocean. So there's two areas that hurricanes like to form, and one of them is off the west coast of Africa, which is out here, and they usually start as like a tropical wave, and there's usually a lot of wind shear and all that, and they're very unorganized, these storms, but they start to pick up rotation as the wind shear kind of lays off, and it allows the storms to form and become very organized, very symmetrical, and they really start to spin, and that creates this pattern that we see of storms coming from east to west. And Florida is definitely more in a vulnerable state as they head across to the west. You can see this on this map here. A ton of them like to cut right through the lower portion of Florida. We have this year in 2025 seen a bunch of hurricanes curve up the East Coast, and I think that's based on a lot of wind shear and a lot of storm systems or low pressure systems cutting across Canada down into the States and pushing all of these storms off east. And the U.S. can be thankful that that's happened this year, because that's happened a lot. There hasn't been much of anything going on this year, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, which is our next vulnerable section. A lot of hurricanes and storms, tropical depressions and tropical storms like to form down here in the Caribbean. And usually warmer ocean temperatures are also very available, but there are not as much wind shear problems, I would say, as opposed to way out in the open here in the Atlantic. So these storms are able to form, and that makes Mississippi, Louisiana, maybe the Gulf Coast here, when we're talking about Alabama, Pensacola, this whole area in here is right on track for the most part to get nailed by these hurricanes. And we do see some hurricanes kind of spin off west as well. But you do see a majority of the time that these storms like to spin off east, which can be scary, especially living anywhere on that Gulf Coast, because it's like a roll of the dice on where these storms are going, and it's very unpredictable. I'm going to leave this picture up here just showing you the power of Hurricane Wilma, and I will continue. So Wilma began as a tropical depression near Jamaica on October 15th, 2005. Maybe I'll leave this one up here for you guys. Near Jamaica, so here's where it actually formed, just off the coast of Jamaica on October 15th, 2005. At first, it was disorganized. Forecasters weren't even sure that this would amount to anything just because it wasn't forming. There was no rotation. It was just kind of like a storm kind of just sitting there, but there was wind shear. The unfortunate thing about that location in specific, to be specific, is that there are warm Caribbean waters, and these temperatures were around 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. They fueled rapid development because the wind shear had really dropped off, and by October 18th, Wilma had become a Category 1 storm. And meteorologists noticed that its pressure was dropping very, very rapidly, which is a huge red flag because the lower that barometric pressure goes, the stronger the hurricane is, and the more intense the wind speed, the bigger the storm, the more defined eye you see. When it's very organized, these are very, very deadly. Between October 18th and October 19th, Wilma underwent one of the most extreme rapid intensification processes ever observed. The pressure plummeted from 982 millibars to 882 millibars in just over 1 day. And that's a 100 millibar drop, which is unheard of. You never see something like that. It's usually around 50 to 60 you'll see in 1 day. This was 100. That is a big change. That is showing you that these storms are just firing off. And it's almost like they're propelled by fuel out in the ocean, and that's based on those warm ocean temperatures. At its peak, Hurricane Wilma sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, which puts it at a Category 5 storm on the Saffir-Simpson scale. The storm's eye, which was incredibly small, it was just 2 miles wide, and it was one of the smallest ever observed, but from space it looked like a spinning buzzsaw. By October 19th, Wilma was a fully formed monster bearing down on the Yucatán Peninsula, so that's when it's coming up through here, through the Yucatán Peninsula, and it's going to hit the coast there of Mexico just very briefly, but it is strong enough to do some damage. And this hit the coastal communities such as Cozumel, Cancun, and Playa del Carmen, and they all braced for impact when this happened. The storm track was kind of a guess at this point because it was very unpredictable about where this storm would actually go. When Wilma made landfall on October 21st, it stalled, and that's the problem, right? When it stalls, you can expect tons and tons of wind, tons and tons of water, storm surge, that's a huge issue. Buildings were stripped from their foundations and roads were washed away. The resorts in Cancun were left in ruins. When we look at the storm surge recorded in these areas, it was over 15 feet, which is very, very catastrophic. And the rainfall totals were over 60 inches, which is 5 feet of rain in some areas. Thousands of tourists were stranded and got caught, and the storm didn't move. It was just hovering for a bit, which really becomes a problem. After slowly crossing the Yucatan, Wilma weakened slightly because it is partially over land, so it doesn't get that fuel that it got when it was just right out over the water. And it was able to bring down its velocity. And on October 24th, Hurricane Wilma made its second landfall near Cape Romano, Florida, as a Category 3 storm. And I'll just load this one up here just so you can see. You can see after it hovered for a bit over Mexico, it took a direct shot right at the southern part of Florida and didn't give people much time. Now, I would hope that as this storm was kind of just hovering over Mexico, that people in Florida were like, let's get out of here, because it's like a roll of the dice where the storm was actually going to head from this point. It hit at Cape Romano, Florida, and had winds around 120 miles per hour, which puts it at a Category 3 storm. What made Wilma's landfall so dangerous was its speed. The storm raced across the state in just 5 hours, and you can see that this straight line shot it right through the Gulf of Mexico there, straight at Florida, and it's a straight line, so you can assume that it really picked up some speed. And even as it crossed through, you can tell that there was speed all the way through this thing, and maybe that's a good thing. It's also a bad thing because storms can pick up some damage, some like wind speed and some life to its storm. So it also raced across the state in 5 hours, which is fast. It hit Naples, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach with destructive winds and tornadoes. So because of the speed, it had a lot of power, which caused a lot of tornadoes. And more than 6 million people were left without power for weeks. Buildings were damaged, roofs were ripped off, and coastal flooding completely destroyed neighborhoods. In the Florida Keys, residents described it as a wall of water that was just brought right in. It swept right through their streets. By the time Wilma exited into the Atlantic, the state was left in chaos. And let's go through some of these pictures. So this is just showing you the amount of rainfall that they had, and that's pretty high up on an SUV. So you can see they had a very big, large amount of waterfall. from this storm. Very unfortunate. And if we go to the next one, you can see this might be kind of like an earlier picture, but you can see the water is going to go up over the edges there and start going up into the land, into homes, and water gets in. And when it does, it starts to ruin everything. Let's see, here's another one. Just to show you the record wind speed that this thing had at 185 miles per hour. When it hit land, it was 120 miles per hour, but it was able to take down palm trees and just throw them right down and rip off roofs of houses and everything. And I'll just leave this up there so you can really get an idea of how strong the winds actually were during the storm. By the time Wilma left, it was in chaos, and the Floridians had a little bit of time to prepare for they didn't have much time to prepare for evacuation. So they were kind of stuck because this thing shot across the Gulf of Mexico. When the skies cleared, the scale of destruction was staggering. Across the Caribbean, Central America, and the United States, Wilma caused $29 billion in damages, making it the fifth costliest hurricane in the U.S. history at the time. And this is 20 years ago. When you put into account 20 years later with inflation and the price of everything just skyrocketing now, this $29 billion is probably closer to 45 or 50. At least 87 people lost their lives to the storm, unfortunately, from flash floods in Haiti to collapsing structures in Mexico and power outages in Florida. In Mexico's Yucatán region, tourism came to a standstill because obviously everything was wrecked. There's nothing there. The recovery took months. Florida faced weeks without electricity and billions in insured losses. The cleanup operations went well into the following year in 2006, and this was just weeks after Hurricane Katrina and Rita occurred. So help was already going to these other places, and I believe Texas and Louisiana were hit by Rita. So resources from the states especially were already going to Texas and Louisiana. Then Florida gets nailed by this hurricane. So we're kind of having FEMA. The resources are starting to wear thin because they're already focused somewhere else, and then another spot gets hit. So it made it pretty difficult. So how did Wilma become so powerful? It was the perfect storm of sea surface temperatures, and obviously they were very, very warm. Low wind shear, which meant that this structure of the storm was able to stay intact and really form based on those ocean temperatures. And the atmosphere was allowing Wilma to breathe, essentially. When the inner core of the storm collapsed and reformed during its rapid intensification, it created that incredibly small eye, concentrating the winds and the pressure even more. Meteorologists call this process an eye wall replacement cycle. It's one of the reasons Wilma was able to sustain such incredible strength for so long. Satellite data from NASA during Wilma's peak gave scientists new insights on how hurricanes intensify, lessons still used today to improve forecasting. Wilma was often overshadowed by Hurricane Katrina. And let's just go to the next picture so we can see. This I thought was an iconic picture. You see three homes with like the same type of tree right out front, knocked right over, and it's like side by side by side. Very, very unfortunate and sad. Glad these trees fell that way, but you can tell that it's taken out some power lines. But that's an iconic picture right there from the storm. Wilma was often overshadowed by Hurricane Katrina, which struck just 2 months earlier in August. But in terms of meteorological strength, Wilma actually surpassed Katrina. So Wilma was actually a stronger hurricane than Katrina. The only problem that New Orleans had is that they were below the water table, which allowed tons and tons of water to pour down into New Orleans and cause tons and tons of damage, which is why we hear about that storm so much as opposed to Hurricane Wilma. Katrina's lowest pressure was 902 millibars, while Wilma's was 882. Wilma was smaller in size, but more compact and intense. If you compare satellite images, Wilma's core looked like a spinning drill, concentrated power in a tiny eye. Rita, another 2005 hurricane, reached 897 millibars, so this was also a huge storm as well. And these three storms together marked one of the most extreme hurricane clusters in recorded history. The 2005 season ended with 28 named storms, 15 of which became hurricanes, and 7 reached major hurricane status. In the aftermath of Wilma, recovery took several months and even years. Florida strengthened their building codes again because they need to just build homes to withstand these storms even more, so then they can just repair as opposed to rebuild the whole thing. And emergency communication systems were improved. Mexico ended up rebuilding its tourism infrastructure, and they restored Cancun's beaches and hotels. But the storm was a wake-up call about overdevelopment in vulnerable coastal zones. So they don't want to have too much going on in these areas, because what's the point if they get totally destroyed? Then they have to pay so much more to have these areas fixed up just to have another storm hit again. So they had to really start focusing on their infrastructure and hopefully their building codes as well. Scientists also studied Wilma to better understand the process of rapid intensification, which is that process where a storm that kind of struggles to get going and they're not really doing too much. And then all of a sudden it's like a snap of the fingers where they go from tropical depression into like a category 4 or 5 hurricane in less than like 24 hours or 48 hours. And that's based on the ocean temperatures and the low wind shear. But obviously the warmer the water, the more fuel that it gives to the hurricane. The data collected from Wilma continues to influence how forecasters predict pressure drops and wind increases in modern storms like Irma, Dorian, and Ian. And I've covered Dorian and Ian on my YouTube page. If you'd like to check that out, please do at the Border City Kids podcast. I will cover Irma in the short future. Looking back, Hurricane Wilma was just a reminder of how quickly calm nature can turn into a catastrophe. What started as a weak tropical depression near Jamaica became one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in history. In less than 3 days, it was outstanding. It showed the importance of early warning systems, evacuation readiness, and the resilience of the communities that stand in the hurricane's path. So let me just go through this a little bit. Here's a picture of Cancun, and you can just see total devastation from these winds. And this was just a coastal community here. This is an iconic picture from the storm just because you see that American flag sitting in the middle, and it always seems to survive these storms, which is very symbolic of unity of the people of the states that come together. This is probably a person just trying to move some of the debris and whatnot off the property, or try and get it away from something if it's blocking doors or windows or exits or something like that. And once again, you can just see the water starting to rise over the edge, and people's homes and houses are off to the side. And this was in Cozumel, where they were rebuilding and trying to recover from their effects as it went through the Yucatán Peninsula. And you could just see tons and tons of damage. And I assume that the technology they have isn't as high as the States was, so they really had to do a lot of manpower work to recover from it. So I believe that is my last picture for this slideshow. So when you hear the name Wilma today, it stands as both a record and a warning. The storm's name was retired from the hurricane list because of how catastrophic it was. It was replaced by Whitney, but its legacy lives on as a benchmark for intensity. So that's going to wrap it up tonight for our in-depth look at Hurricane Wilma, one of the most powerful and fascinating storms ever recorded. If you found this information session helpful, or if you liked participating or just watching or learning something new tonight, and if you're here, I appreciate that. You can always go to one of our videos. You can always watch this later. But every Thursday night, I am doing these live streams because I like to cover these storms. I personally find them very interesting. I cover tornadoes and hurricanes for the most part. I got lots of material to come up with for the next while, so I'll be good on that. But if you ever have a suggestion, please write it in the chat below, and I will try and get to it in future episodes. Please subscribe and share the show to people who love this kind of stuff. When Nature Strikes, please pay attention to When Nature Strikes for more deep dives into more extreme weather events. You can also check out our episodes, Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Katrina, and Hurricane Ivan, which Hurricane Ivan actually comes out tomorrow. If you want to check that out, that would be great. It will be available tomorrow at noon Eastern time. But until next time, and I will be back for sure because this is great, stay safe, stay calm, and always remember that when nature strikes, it strikes without warning, We'll see you later. Have a good night. Enjoy the weekend.